Good afternoon and welcome back together. It's been a beautiful Shabbat of meaning, learning, and connecting. I hope you found the last couple of sessions insightful and gained wisdom from our speakers and from others in the room. It's a joy to be back with you. Again, my name is Heidi Siegel. I am the director of the Commission on Social Action for Reform Judaism. Yesterday, I spoke to you all about the respectful gathering we've aimed to create here this weekend. They are reflected in the code of conduct we all agreed to when we registered, and that can be found in your conference app. And I asked you, and thank you for sharing with me the moments of true connection you've experienced over the last few days. I asked you to find me if there are moments that do not meet that standard. Thank you for trusting me with that too. I'm sorry for any experiences that have fallen short of the holy space we strive for. Please keep seeking me out in the coming days to share when those experiences happen and also the moments of joy that you're experiencing as well. And as we move forward this afternoon, evening, tomorrow, and Monday, I hope we continue to listen to and hear from each other with intentionality and to speak with care for the words we choose and the ways they will continue to be experienced by others. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rabbi Stacy Rigler, the CEO of the Association of Reformed Jewish Educators. My pronouns are she, her. We're taught in the Talmud that a ruler is not to be appointed until the community is consulted. So I'm curious, by show of hands, who in this room was part of the RAC's Every Voice, Every Vote campaign last year? Raise your hand if you sent a postcard, a text, or made a phone call. And who of you voted in our last election? Amazing. Tomorrow, together, we'll launch Every Voice, Every Vote 2026, because we know that in addition to the other work we have to do, ensuring every voice is heard and every vote is counted is essential to a healthy democracy. But democracy also relies on other pillars too, like the rule of law and upholding rights and freedoms. By many accounts, our democracy is weakening. With it, we are experiencing rising levels of anti-Semitism. That worries us deeply as Jews. And we know that other communities are also facing their own threats. We've learned this weekend how these threads are interwoven. In our listening sessions, we heard from passionate, longtime activists facing deep challenges. When talking about our democracy, our listening session participants use words like angry, embarrassed, and scared. As Alyssa in Ohio told us, my kids don't know a time when two political parties work together to solve real issues. That hurts so much. For me, I grew up here in the Washington, D.C. region, where I was able to develop friendships with peers who often held very different political beliefs than I did. We were bound together by geography, not ideology. As a political science major at Emory University, I began to explore my role as a Jew in the American political story. I learned from my professor, Deborah Lipstadt, about conditional whiteness, how at times I could walk through the world with every privilege and freedom America offered, but how as a member of the Jewish community, that privilege was conditional and had historically been revoked. At that time, honestly, almost 30 years ago, it felt very academic. And I'm not sure I thought about it much when I started my career as a Jewish educator. But fast forward to the life-changing election of 2016, when I began to jump into the world of community organizing and take action personally. As an educator, I always begin with learning, so I signed up for a life-changing anti-racism training led by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, sponsored by our local Faith in Action network. At that training, I came to see and feel what Professor Lipstadt had described. I was named for my great-grandmother, Serena. She was hidden in a cellar in Hungary to survive the Holocaust. My grandparents brought her here where she lived in the same room as my mother for the rest of her life. But I lived my entire life in privileged places and spaces, never knowing her fears and worries, never experiencing a hint of her worldview until now. The experience of oppression is part of our shared DNA, as it is of too many of our neighbors and friends, and we're beginning to know what that fear tastes like. As a leader in the Jewish community, I find myself asking, how can I ensure I'm doing my part in the journey towards justice, both for our community and our democracy? 10 years ago, the president of the NCAA, Reverend Cornell Williams Brooks, led the journey for justice. This 860-mile march from Selma to Washington, D.C., was joined by every leg of activists from across the United States, including hundreds of Reformed clergy and congregants. My husband was among the marchers. I heard stories and saw pictures from him and other colleagues who had the privilege of joining in that march. Raise your hand if you were part of that extraordinary journey. Now, we are on a new journey towards justice, and we're thrilled to have Reverend Brooks, now at Harvard, with us this afternoon, as well as being joined by Amy Spitalnik of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Amy is one of the foremost experts on fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. In fact, you may know her from her previous role at Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for Charlottesville violence. Please join in giving all of our speakers a warm welcome.
And our speakers will be joined by Rabbi Ambassador David Saperstein.
I think they would have figured it out, Jonah, but thank you very much. So the period from the end of World War II until quite recently is one of the most remarkable periods in all of Jewish history, a true golden age for the Jewish community, spurred by the economic growth of America, spurred by the sensitivities to anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, spurred by an immense expansion of First Amendment rights, first by the Supreme Court of the United States, including the freedom of religion and separation of church and state components of the First Amendment, but an expansion of the freedom of the press and freedom of speech, freedom of the right of association and to protest the government. All of that led to an extraordinary period that gave opportunities to minorities in America and to women in America that our great-grandparents, with all the systemic structural problems we still face, that our great-grandparents could have only dreamed of. And for Jews, it moved us from the laws that the Congress began to pass afterwards, the civil rights laws, the laws protecting LGBTQ rights, the laws protecting women's rights, a whole range of expansion of fundamental rights. It moved Jews from facing quotas in many areas of American life, in business courtrooms and universities and other places across the country, to the very center of American political, academic, economic, and political life. It is a nation that has given us more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities, more achievements than we have known in the entirety of the 2,500 years of diaspora life. And now, a lot of the underpinnings of that feel threatened. An expansion of anti-Semitism and a weakening of democracy. It is on those two dynamics in American life and in truth on a global scene that we're going to be discussing this morning in the relationship of the two of them, the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight to preserve democracy and strengthen democracy, and what happens when both are weakened and endangered. So I'm going to turn Amy, who has been absolutely spectacular since she joined the head of JCPA, skyrocketed to a level of the first order of progressive Jewish leaders of Jewish organizational life in a powerful, dramatic, and inspiring form, and a key ally to us in so much of the work that we're doing. Amy, I'm going to turn to begin to you, to ask you to just reflect on the relationship of the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight to preserve the cornerstones of American democracy.
Well, now I have to talk after David Saperstein makes me verklempt, so, you know. And I will say it's really an honor and a privilege to be here. The Reform Movement, the RAC, have really been, I think, among our closest partners, David, Rick, Jonah, Barb, Liz. Like, the work that we've been able to do together in the last 2 years has been among the most meaningful since I've stepped into this role, and I'm just so grateful to look around this room and see so many other friends and partners who I've gotten to know through this job and prior ones, and to be here with you as well, Brooks. And so it's a really challenging moment if you care about Jewish safety or you care about democracy, and I would argue that if you care about one, you have to care about the other because they're one and the same. And we're in this moment where, for certainly my lifetime, and I think as Rabbi Saperstein described, the long arc of recent Jewish history, it feels like so much that has kept us safe and that has been at the core of what's made this such a great country to be a Jew in recent decades is under threat. I'm the grandkid of Holocaust survivors who came here looking for a better life. My parents were New York City public school teachers and union members, and it was that allowed them to build a life for me and my sister and put us on the trajectory where my own daughter is hopefully gonna live an even greater life than the ones her parents and grandparents had. But we're looking at a moment where raising a Jewish kid in America, much like so many other communities that are facing threats, comes with real uncertainty at a time when it's perhaps, 10 years ago would have felt unfathomable, and that's both because of the threats to the Jewish community specifically, including the rich diversity of our community, and the compounding threats to so many other communities and our democracy more broadly. If we're going to understand the deep interconnection between Jewish safety and democracy, I think it's important to actually name what anti-Semitism is. Of course, it's hating us as Jews because of who we are, what we look like, how we pray or don't pray, what we eat or don't eat. But also at its core, it's inherently a conspiracy theory, this insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in tropes and lies around Jewish control and power, intended to pit communities against one another, to sow distrust in our institutions, and to ultimately undermine the fabric of our democracy by making it seem like there is some sort of insidious effort, a cabal, or however you want to describe it, to undermine our government or our foreign policy or our economy or whatever it might be. And so we know how this manifests, for example, on the right. Nazis in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," speaking very directly to the ways in which anti-Semitism is inextricably linked with the rights and safety of all communities and our democracy. This idea that the Jews are seeking to orchestrate the replacement of the white race by supporting Black and brown communities, immigrants coming up from the southern border, Black Lives Matter, the stealing of our elections, or other efforts to ascribe Jewish power to how elections have turned out, or so much more. And certainly now, as we see these conspiracy theories, these replacement and invasion lies become so normalized in our politics, we see how they're being used not just to fuel a cycle of attacks like Charlottesville or Pittsburgh, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history, or Poway, or El Paso, which targeted the Latino community, or Buffalo, which targeted the Black community, or Christchurch in New Zealand, which targeted the Muslim community. But we're also now seeing them underpin the very draconian policies going after immigrant rights, voting rights, and so much more at a time when it's all becoming so normalized and being used as a tool to not just threaten Jews, but all communities in the fabric of our democracy right now. It's sometimes harder to understand how, particularly post-October 7th, these very same anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes exist on parts of the left or in other cases removed from the ideological spectrum, aimed at dividing Jews from the very coalition spaces and communities in which we need to be if we're going to protect our democracy. Tropes and conspiracy theories about Jewish or Zionist control and power, how we're influencing foreign policy, how Zionists should not be welcome in certain spaces, using it as a pejorative when the majority of us do have a relationship with Israel, even if we don't necessarily support its government, and increasingly violent acts of anti-Semitism like we saw at the Capitol Jewish Museum in Boulder, Colorado, and targeting Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, all under the guise of protesting Israel, but seeking to hold Jews accountable for their actions. And so we know how this manifests across the ideological spectrum, how salient of a wedge anti-Semitism is to pit us against one another and sow distrust in our democracies and divide Jews from other communities. And we're also being offered false choices on both ends of the political spectrum. On the right, we're being offered a false choice by the Trump administration and others, telling us that the only way to counter anti-Semitism is to undermine our core democratic norms and values, academic freedom, due process, academic research, the rule of law, so much else that has come under threat, as we've seen with the attacks on universities and unions and more. And on the left, we're being told that we as Jews can't be proudly Jewish or have a relationship with Israel and still stand for small d democratic and humanitarian values. We're being offered these false choices. And so we're in this feedback loop where anti-Semitism is being used as this tool to undermine democracy, to fuel increasingly normalized hate and extremism and draconian policies. And as our democratic norms and values erode, anti-Semitism is allowed to further thrive and flourish because people are looking for a scapegoat and a reason for what's happening. And so the way we break out of this feedback loop is to actually understand how anti-Semitism and anti-democratic extremism are inextricably linked and are being used to pit us against one another and keep our coalitions together rather than become susceptible to that very divisive cycle.
A very helpful start. I really appreciate it.
Very hopeful too, right?
Cornell Brooks brings together in his distinguished, diverse career different elements of what is at the core of our response to this. He did some extraordinary work in New Jersey here with local communities for a long period of time. That was kind of work we all cited in terms of coalition building. He headed one of the truly historic, important entities, the NAACP, involved in civil rights work in America, and he's now holding prestigious roles at Harvard University. That's right in the maelstrom of many of the challenges that we face in this area here. So he brings all of that to bear. For any who don't know, you should know the connection Jonah and I, between us, have served nearly 40 years on the national board of the NAACP, and therefore Cornell Brooks' role in that was a cherished one that had bound us together as well here. So let me turn it to you, Cornell, to offer some opening comments on the relationship of the fight against anti-Semitism and to preserve democracy.
So first of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to the RAC and to everyone here. I'm mindful, having led the NAACP, the only organization other than the ADL to be formed in the wake of a lynching, and an organization founded by African Americans and Jews. I simply want to say thank you for this invitation. Thank you to Jonah. Thank you to Rabbi Saperstein. Certainly to Amy Spitalnik. 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 I want to make sure I'm correct. And to all of you for creating this moment to have this conversation. I'm mindful that we convene at a moment in which we find ourselves in an age of authoritarianism, fueling anti-Semitism, but also fueled by anti-Semitism. And in this moment, I'm reminded of what I'd like to call the jurisprudence of oppression, and also the literature of rebellion. And when I think about the jurisprudence of oppression, I'm reminded of the scholar James Whitman at Yale Law School, who wrote a book called Hitler's American Model. And you recall in the 1930s that the legal architects of that murderous regime, Nazi Germany, studied America's immigration laws, studied America's miscegenation laws, studied America's laws related to relegating black people to second-class citizenship so that they might first relegate Jewish people to second-class citizenship in order to prepare them for industrial murder. And so I cite this jurisprudence of oppression to drive home the obvious point that there is not merely a convergence of the histories of oppression in terms of black people who are not Jewish, because there are black people who are Jewish, and black people, amen, black people and Jews more broadly, that there's an intersection here, and that in this moment when so many are trying to poison, toxify, and destroy the relationship between black people and black people who are, Jewish people and black people, it is important for us to bear in mind this history. But I'm also reminded of the literature of rebellion. When I arrived at Boston University School of Theology as a not particularly well-traveled or cosmopolitan student, I was encouraged to take a class from a man whom I'd never heard of. His name was Elie Wiesel. He taught a class called The Literature of Rebellion, in which we studied stories and histories and tales. These stories, these histories, these tales spoke to a sense of resilience, a sense of rebellion, a sense of asserting one's humanity in the face of unimaginable oppression. In this room, with this gathering of God's people, we have to bear in mind the jurisprudence of oppression, and we also have to bear in mind the literature of rebellion, our canon of our Jewish values, right? And when I say our, let me be clear about this. The theologian James Coleman, James Cole, made it clear that the theology of the black church owes a tremendous debt of theological gratitude to the Jewish or Hebrew prophets. There can be no black church without Jewish values. In other words, the black church that resisted slavery, the black church that resisted lynching, the black church that resisted Jim Crow owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to Jewish values, scripture, the canon, the Torah. And so we're in this place at this moment, able to resist, able to stand up and to stand together. Now, as was mentioned, I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And you may have heard that we've experienced a few difficulties related to anti-Semitism. And I'm mindful of the fact that we are at a moment in which anti-Semitism has risen, skyrocketed, doubled. I'm mindful of the fact that we are experiencing a level of hate crimes, anti-Semitic hate crimes, and anti-black hate crimes that are unprecedented. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by hate crimes. I mean hate crimes as in intimidation. I mean hate crimes as in assault. I mean hate crimes as in murder. I mean hate crimes as in Jewish people feeling unsafe, Jewish students feeling unsafe, black people feeling unsafe, black people feeling vulnerable. In our democracy, in this, the republic that we created, in this place for which we have shed so much blood and lifted up so much sacrifice. And so on the campus of Harvard University, you're well aware that in the wake of October 7th, statements, not all particularly well thought out, were issued. We saw students experiencing intimidation and fear and apprehension on the campus of America's oldest university. In the wake of that, Harvard commissioned 2 reports, one on anti-Semitism, one on Islamophobia. And in response to these reports, numbering some 500 pages, our government declined to investigate either report. I want to be clear here. I began my career as an attorney in the United States Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. I am unaware of any suits ever being brought in which there was no investigation. I'm unaware of any legal settlements attempted without an investigation. But in response to 2 reports on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, they ignored the second, didn't read the first, and didn't respond to either one. And the reason why this is important is because if you've ever had the experience of hearing people tell their stories of being discriminated against, hearing people tell their stories of being put down, hearing people tell their stories of being hurt, harmed, bruised in terms of their humanity, it is ungodly, it is wrong, it is sinful for lawyers to ignore their stories and attempt to misuse their pain. And what did our government do? Our government talked about their campaign against anti-Semitism and managed to wage a war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, closing all diversity offices at Harvard. So much so that when we had affinity celebrations, this is a modest point, a ceremonial point, but an emblematic point, such that when we arrived in the season of graduations, there was no Jewish graduation, there was no black graduation ceremonies, no veteran ceremonies, no LGBTQ ceremonies. So in other words, we all had to celebrate less with respect to our individual communities and Harvard as a community in the name of this ostensible war against anti-Semitism. Why would this be important? It would be important because when you have people who are literally trying to pit us against one another, one of the best ways to do that, one of the best ways to have people subscribe to these conspiracy theories, subscribe to these notions of these cabals and people controlling our every waking moment and controlling our democracy, is to literally have people doubt one another's good intentions. And the reason why this is particularly odious and disturbing is in the wake of October 7th, I had Muslim students, Arab students, Palestinian students, Jewish students ask Harvard professors, why won't you teach us? Why can't we learn? Why can't we morally deliberate together with respect to what's happening in Israel and Gaza? And one of the most difficult moments in my life as a professor and as a civil rights leader is explaining to people that we're too afraid to talk. We're too afraid to teach. This is an example of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. We're in a moment in which we have what I call utilitarian anti-Semites. These utilitarian anti-Semites are people who use anti-Semitism to advance narrow political agendas, whether it be on the left or the right. And the reason why we know that they're utilitarian anti-Semites is because they decline to condemn white supremacists. They decline to condemn the people who practice the Great Replacement theory. They decline to condemn anti-black racism among the people who claim to be friends of the Jewish people. If you can explain to me how you can be a card-carrying racist and support Jewish people, I'll just leave you with this modest example, illustration of the point. When I was at the NAACP, in a week, maybe 80 or 90 hours of work, I decided to take a spare moment and read the hate mail. Amy, you might find this interesting. So I took a moment to read the hate mail, and I read letter after letter demonstrating anti-Black racism. But one of the things I discovered was the letters that condemned the NAACP for its vigorous stance in support of Black people's rights. Those were the same letters that called the NAACP and its history into account for standing with Jewish people. I didn't read any letters from racists that did not also contain anti-Semitism. And so what I want to suggest to you in this moment is the very people who hate me as a Black Christian do not like you. Whether they live in a small house, a large house, or the White House.
I was one of the keynoters of a conference on anti-Semitism. Eric Ward was there with me, and there was a skinhead who had abandoned their view, but was trying to explain to us how they see America. And they made it very clear that the effort of Blacks to have equal rights with whites, the effort of people of color to flood across our southern border and change the configuration of America, the people of different religions that were undermining Christianity, character of America, and the LGBTQ community is destroying our family. They were all symptoms of what was wrong with America, and Jews are the cause. Never forgot that line about the connection of this.
The evidence in the Charlottesville case is the case in point for that. And I definitely encourage folks to take a look at it if you want to understand it more deeply. It's frightening.
So I actually was going to ask you to follow up because Cornell eloquently answered the second question about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Here, one dramatic, by the way, example of the damage done is those civil rights divisions that he worked for. They're being dismantled. Dismantled in the Department of Education, shrunken and refocused in the Department of Justice away from core civil rights work. And therefore, what's being done to decimate civil rights in DEI is the attack on DEI is a classic effort to undercut all the civil rights achievements. It also affects every incident of anti-Semitism that the government has to respond to here. And instead, the weaponization that you refer to is damaging democracy as well. You want to add anything on that aspect, weaponization of anti-Semitism to fight other aspects of what is best about America?
I'll say a few things. I think one, first and foremost, we're really proud to work with the Reform Movement, the Conservative Movement, the Reconstructionist Movement, and others on a statement rejecting this false choice that we've been talking about. I think at this moment we are constantly being told by everyone from the White House on down that we have to choose between Jewish safety and democracy, and we know, as we've been discussing here, that that's a false choice. And so that statement is on our website, I know the RAC's website, and we hope that it's also a resource to all of you as you are grappling with these questions in your communities. But just to put a fine point of it, look, if this administration truly cared about Jewish safety, they wouldn't be gutting the very programs that we have to keep the Jewish community safe, whether it's the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed, which is actually the tool we have to protect Jewish and all students' civil rights on campus. Instead, they've totally decimated OCR. Those offices have been shut down around the country. They're trying to move it to a different department while killing it at the same time. They wouldn't have decimated hate crimes prevention programs where we have partners, including, for example, our local Jewish community partner in Broward County, where they have a joint grant, I believe, with the NAACP down there that was totally gutted by as part of the hate crimes prevention grants that this administration has killed. They wouldn't be playing politics with nonprofit security grants, trying to tell synagogues and other institutions that you have to allow ICE into your facilities or otherwise not do illegal DEIA, whatever that means. We should all still apply for nonprofit security grants, I should note, but we should be clear about how they're trying to politicize them. They wouldn't be appointing people with neo-Nazi ties and other anti-Semitic ties to senior positions at the Department of Defense, or folks like Paul Ingrassia, who says that he has a Nazi streak. So if we're going to be honest about whether this administration is serious about countering anti-Semitism or whether they're exploiting our legitimate fears and concerns to advance an extremist agenda, we should look at what they're doing, we should look at what they're saying, and we should look at who they've appointed. And none of those things make Jews safer. They only make us and each and every other community less safe. And it's on all of us across the ideological and denominational spectrum of the Jewish community to call that out and name it, because it is fundamentally at odds with our safety and our values.
So let's build on that for a moment here. I want to reflect on coalitional relations and what has been the impact of the events of these last years, the event of President Trump on coalitional relations, the event of October 7th on coalitional relations. We can give extraordinary stories where coalitions have held and done dramatic things, and other alarming examples where coalitions have been divided and torn apart over many of the changes that have taken place. So I want to ask you each to just give us your assessment of how to think about the strains in this area and what we can do to heal those strains. Amy, let me start with you again on that.
Well, Cornell was talking earlier about the founding of the NAACP, and one of the things that I'm most proud of from JCPA's own history is that the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and whose board Jonah and I both sit, was founded by the NAACP and what was then known as NACRAC, now JCPA. Not the sexiest of names, NACRAC. Not that JCPA is much better in our alphabet soup of Jewish organizations, but NACRAC was really something. But NACRAC and NAACP co-founded the Leadership Conference with some unions and others in 1950. And I would say for me, that's one of the places where the coalitional work has actually not only been held together by really important work, including by a number of people who are sitting in this room over the last 2 years, but has actually been a model for how we can move forward at a time when there are so many loud voices trying to pit us against others. Jonah, David, and I and others in this room spend a lot of time, both publicly and behind the scenes, with our partners within that coalition in the months after October 7th, talking about how we can move forward, how we can understand each other's concerns, and how we can continue to advance both the civil rights and liberties that are at the core of these civil rights coalitions, like the Leadership Conference, and do so in a way that doesn't discount the real fear and pain and isolation felt in the Jewish community, in the Muslim or Arab American communities, in the Black communities, and in others in this moment. And I think, in many ways, we've seen that play out, including a really important statement from the Leadership Conference on campus protests that both was focused on protecting civil liberties and civil rights, and named the ways in which some of these protests have certainly crossed the line into overt anti-Semitism, ostracization, and other harm against Jewish students. And we saw it, for example, in the statement that we worked on with the Leadership Conference after the Boulder attack, from 60 civil rights groups making clear that when Jews are targeted for the actions of the Israeli government, that's anti-Semitism, period, full stop. And we should stop trying to parse this as about Israeli politics or not. When Jews are murdered because of under the guise of protesting Israel, that is anti-Semitism. And having a statement from 60 civil rights groups across sort of the LGBTQ, Muslim, Arab, Black, Latino, and other communities saying as much was really important at a moment when many in our community were feeling isolated and alone. And of course, now as we're seeing voting rights and immigrant rights and congressional hearings targeting nonprofits under attack in ways that we haven't seen for decades, that coalition is frankly more important than ever. And so it's been challenging. It has felt isolating, I'm sure, as many of you have felt over the last 2 years. But I'm also deriving real hope from spaces like the Leadership Conference and other work we're doing, for example, with the national teachers unions like AFT, where people are willing to stay at the table, to have the hard conversations, and to recognize that those trying to divide our coalitions in this moment have everything to gain, and all of us in those coalitions have everything to lose by letting them succeed.
So, one of the wonderful things about being a panelist here is that every other minute I hear something that should be taught where I teach. Let me note a couple of things here. That when we look at the polling with respect to our communities, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Jewish, Gentile, with respect to the possibilities of democracy in this country and in Israel, we see divisions based on race, based on party, based on generation. And we see divisions and differences in terms of levels of support, but much of this is driven by generation. And that suggests to me that we focus much more of our attention on young people and on students. Because I've noticed a kind of premature resignation by older people in terms of younger people, dismissing students on the college campuses as being hopeless, being naive. And may I share something with you? And I ask that you all keep this within the room, cone of silence, right? Some of the frustrations I sense in the Jewish community are not unlike the frustrations among Black people who are not Jewish, but the frustrations among parents, right? In other words, parents who are frustrated by their children's opinions on various things, right? But that is no reason to give up on young people, no reason to write off the college campus, no reason not to invest in organizing and educating our students, right? And this may seem odd advice to give to people my age, but we have to have patience. And what that means is on our college campuses, our students are engaged quite often in moral deliberation. They engage in debate and discourse that's often messy. I heard in a panel right before coming into this session about making room for, I believe the term was raggedy discourse. Not insisting that everyone state things with the precision of a lobbyist for the rag. And so I think this is just incredibly important in this moment. I also want to suggest that we publicize our victories much more vigorously, right? So in other words, there are those in our republic who like to suggest that anti-Semitism is an inevitable. It is a fact of life. It has been this way. It will always be this way. That is not the case, right? They like to suggest that there are folks on the left, folks on the right who are the way they are, and there's nothing that we can do about it. I want to suggest to you that we demonstrate the resilience, the hopefulness, the moral self-confidence that gave rise to the RAC, that gave rise to the NAACP. And so what that means is on our college campuses, we're going to have to assert that we believe in our young people and their ability to engage in moral deliberation and have messy conversations, right? And I'll leave you with this thought as to why I'm hopeful. 2 years ago, I received an award from the Kennedy School for teaching and demonstrating the ability to have conversations on difficult subjects. That was also the same year that Charlie Kirk placed me on his professor's watch list. The same year. I say that to say we possess within ourselves the ability to engage our young people in serious, thoughtful, sustained conversation and dialogue. We need not give up. And the RAC has led and can lead. Not merely with respect to your state conferences, but literally the country. At Harvard, I've seen students who were in high school who participated on the journey who ended up in my class in graduate school. I believe in this organization.
Let me just probe one of the most complicated aspects of coalitional work here, because October 7th changed a lot. The Middle East crisis has changed a lot. The changing image of Israel and Palestinians has changed a lot. And we will have people with very different views, sometimes views that may be anathema to us in the Jewish community, and may be anathema our views. It's not good enough to be a liberal Zionist. There are some who want us to make declarations of anti-Zionism. How do we think about those coalitions in those groups? There are some in our community say that those who have done anything anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist, we shouldn't be in coalition. And there's, of course, resistance to us being in progressive coalitions, et cetera. Just reflect a little more deeply about that piece of it. Amy, why don't you start, and then Cornell.
Well, first of all, we're not going to solve anti-Semitism by only talking to people who already agree with us. And so I think that is an important starting point, right? Oftentimes we're told, don't be at the table with certain folks. Those are exactly the people we probably need to be at the table with, and that's different than validating them or amplifying them, but engaging is how we actually do this. I think it's also important to understand that things are messy in this regard. I'm among the last generation of not just American Jews, but Americans or anyone who knew an Israel that was under daily existential threat, that knew an Israel that wasn't led by Bibi Netanyahu, however you feel about him, although I can guess in this room generally how folks feel about him. And that knew an Israel led by a Rabin, for example, where there was a hope for a peaceful future and a willingness to come to the table. And that matters, that I'm really among the last generation that knew that Israel compared to those younger than me right now. And that shapes their perspective of the conflict. It shapes the David and Goliath dynamics that I think many of us who were raised with relationships with Israel had understood in one way and are now very clearly playing out in the other way. And so what we need to do both within our community and more broadly is create space for people to grapple with that, to recognize that they can clearly and unequivocally stand for Palestinian human rights and dignity and self-determination and speak out against the catastrophe in Gaza and speak out against the actions of the Israeli government, and do so in a way that doesn't also discount the humanity and dignity of the Israeli people and the horrors of October 7th and the fact that we've had hostages still in Gaza until not very long ago. I think one body is still remaining as of today. And so we have to create the space for that complexity and nuance and to reject the binaries and the zero-sum framing that so many both within our community and outside of it continue to reinforce through this black and white thinking. And by doing that, we in turn help people understand that there is a way to advocate for those Palestinian rights without crossing the line into, for example, using the word Zionist as a pejorative, saying that Zionists, which, the vast majority of American Jews, 80 to 90% of us, have a relationship with Israel. For me, that term simply means the belief in Jewish self-determination somewhere in this place in the world where we have deep historical connections. It goes hand in hand with Palestinian self-determination. It doesn't mean I support the actions of its government. But we're hearing this term being twisted in the public conversation by extremes on both ends to fit their political agenda. And how we help people understand that the majority of American Jews have this relationship with Israel, and using it as a pejorative, using it as this term to, again, effectively shrink the tables that we can be at, only harms us and harms the coalitions that we can be in. So we need to have red lines. We need to be able to say, some people will never, ever see the humanity and dignity of Jews or Israelis, and there's probably not a way to engage many of them. But there are also those who are willing to engage, who are not going to align with us, who have fundamental policy disagreements on many fronts, but will still call out anti-Semitism or want to understand it better or recognize the dignity and humanity of Jews and Israelis at a time when that is so crucial. And so we need to be able to differentiate, we need to be able to hold that complexity, and we need to be able to give people space and grace to grapple with that complexity as we engage them.
Cornell?
One of the things I've noticed among college students and young people is not necessarily appreciating the diversity among your supporters as opposed to the diversity among your opponents. And what I mean by that is when we appreciate the diversity among our allies, it may give us space to appreciate the diversity among our opponents. Specifically, my Jewish students are tremendously diverse in terms of their perspectives on the possibilities of democracy in America and in Israel. Tremendously diverse with respect to what they deem to be the possibilities of peace and justice with respect to the Palestinians. If we appreciate the diversity in the family, can't we appreciate the diversity among those who are, let's say, distant cousins, right? And what I find is when we talk about coalitional politics, when we talk about allyship, we have to appreciate the same diversity that we have to tolerate at the Thanksgiving table, we have to extend to others. And that means we cannot have a situation where we demand a price be paid in terms of being at the membership table. Like, in other words, you cannot have a situation where you have Jewish students having to renounce Israel, renounce Zionism, in order to be at any kind of conversation with respect to dialogue. Point one. Point two, I think it would be helpful for many of our students to have a broader political and theological understanding of Zionism and the diversity with respect to Zionism and the diversity with respect to people who call themselves Zionists. What I find is that lack of appreciation, right? So in other words, Elie Wiesel was a Zionist, Mordecai Kaplan was a Zionist, Abraham Joshua Heschel was a Zionist, but three very different kinds of people, right? And so in other words, without the history, there's a lack of nuance. And if our young people don't have the history, who's to be blamed? Who's to be held accountable? But I don't like what's happening at Harvard. I try to do a better job teaching. I'm asking the question. I've stated it too obscurely, I haven't been sufficiently clear. When you as a parent find it difficult to relate to your children, maybe your children could be more relatable, or maybe we can do a little better job in terms of parenting. I really think that this is a moment where we need to teach more, demonstrate an appreciation for the diversity within the family and beyond the family, and extend grace. Extend grace. It is needed now.
So a final question here. I'd like to ask each of you, not going to surprise you with this, each of you to just reflect for a minute on what brings you hope in this extraordinary period about America, about the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight against racism in this country, restoring the kind of sense of a robust democracy that included the protection of every group who's been subject to persecution and discrimination in our country. As you look at the enormous challenges we have in front of us, what brings you hope? Amy, you want to start off?
Totally easy question. Look, I spent a lot of time on the road in communities around the country, and that brings me hope, because while it has felt somewhat institutionally lonely doing the work that we do, trying to make clear that both Jewish safety and inclusive democracy must coexist, although in this room and with the Reform movement, less institutionally lonely. But the truth is the vast majority of Jewish Americans, and I would say most people that I get to talk to on the road, across geographic and ideological and other diversity, are actually able to hold that complexity, actually want to reject these false choices that we're talking about, actually are sick of the extreme polarized approaches to these issues and want someone to just help them understand and move forward in a moment like this when we're continually being told that somehow our safety as Jews is at odds with our democracy, or our inclusive democracy is at odds with our safety as Jews, when we know one can't exist without the other. And so I'm finding a huge amount of hope just being out on the road with real Jewish Americans and others who are willing to reject these false choices and false binaries. And I mean, second is, I have a 3-year-old daughter. I'm raising a Jewish 3-year-old in this country right now. So I have no other choice, right? Her great-grandparents survived the Holocaust. I don't have a choice. I've chosen to bring her into this world, and I think having a kid is an optimistic act at a time like this. And to your point, we have no other choice but to do this work. So whether or not we want to, whether or not there's reasons for optimism, although I think there are, or reasons for hope, although I think there are, we also have no choice right now. And so for me, that's what drives me to do this each and every day, in addition to the great partners like those reflected around the room here at the RAC.
So I have a number of reasons to be hopeful. Some of them are empirical, others are not. Objectively speaking, we are not where we were 2 years ago with respect to young people. There's a greater sense of nuance. I think there's a greater appreciation for the necessity of compromise. There is a sense that we are all being collectively threatened, and as such, we need to collectively stand together. That gives me tremendous hope. When I look across the campus where I teach and I see students pulling together communities and constituencies that don't normally sit together, organizing among themselves, realizing that the threat is quite great and it is existential, I have hope. I have hope when I receive papers from students, many of whom are Jewish, who provide the best education for me as a professor on the condition of not only the Jewish community, but also the Palestinian community. There are not too many Palestinians at the Kennedy School. There are quite a few Jewish students at the Kennedy School. And the best teachers, or some of the best teachers, are people who are teaching on a subject that they care about, they're not necessarily experiencing. That gives me hope. Lastly, as a descendant of enslaved people who were enslaved in the low country of South Carolina, I think about a woman by the name of Harriet Tubman. As you well recall, Harriet Tubman led 70 people to freedom on the Underground Railroad. What is less noted is that she, being the first woman to lead American troops into battle, freed 750 people in the low country of South Carolina, including my 5th great-grandfather, Jack Weinglass. Why am I hopeful? Because had Harriet Tubman compared the 800 people she freed to the 4 million people who were enslaved, she might have given up. Hope is not empirically demonstrated, it is morally chosen. We choose to be hopeful. We choose to believe. We choose to believe that this is our democracy. We will not give over to autocracy, and we will preserve it for our children and our legacy. David spoke about a golden age. I believe that there's a platinum age before us, and it is ours to seize.
So, here is one of the great challenges that we face. There wasn't a single achievement that this movement fought for, the NAACP fought for in the 20th century, that we brought about, that did not happen because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill and multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalitions of decency in every community across America. The problem for us is definitions of partisanship have changed these days here. And what was always a bipartisan issue on Capitol Hill now is a partisan divide, even though our position has not changed one iota on them. And the primary example of that is voting rights. We're proud of the fact that the civil rights community's contribution to the 65 Voting Rights Act was drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center, where the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was located for 30 years. We're proud that we were part of those efforts over those next 30 years to move the reauthorization over and over again with enormous bipartisan support. The last time it was voted on in the Congress was 2006. It passed 384 to 36 in the House of Representatives. It passed unanimously in the Senate of the United States. It was signed by a Republican president. And I've always said, if we lose the Republican Party, it will be hard to maintain America. So when we talk about every voice, every vote, it's not just getting Democratic votes out, it's getting those Republicans who have been appalled by their own party. And even if it feels like a small number, they can shift the outcome of primary elections that will make a difference for us. So this work we're doing really is bipartisan work. And at the core of that is the foundation of a democracy that is the Voting Rights Act. So you're going to be seeing on your app an effort to bring your attention to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the Congress. He was, of course, a true friend of our movement and worked very closely with us as we did with him, and we're deeply proud of the work that we did together. But voting rights are a foundation of democracy, and this bill will continue what he has done, restore the full coverage of the Voting Rights Act. It is more important than ever. And again, there'll be no Noah's Ark that will protect Jews if democracy falls apart here. And if any group can be persecuted as we feel unthreatened, as we do from anti-Semitism, as the Black community does from the rise of racism again in this country, none of us will be safe. We are all in this together. All of us are in this together. Thank you so, so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Cornell Brooks and Amy Spitalnik.